human being? What is my essence? There aren't many options. Is a human being a person, a self? Only material, entirely physical? Or in some sense, non-physical, in part or in whole? Could humans have a non-physical component of some kind, a soul or a non-material spirit? I've spent much of my life thinking about consciousness, from neuroscience as a grad student to philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion in recent decades. And while I've thought I had explored this intellectual terrain rather well, I've realized that I've explored only its Western regions, mainly its sectors of Christian philosophy. I'm now determined to explore global philosophy in addressing big questions. The philosophical traditions of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, China, and Africa, each in its own right and each in dialogue with Western Judeo-Christian philosophy. Here, global philosophy, what is a person? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey. Closer to Truth is pursuing global philosophy of religion in collaboration with the University of Birmingham, led by Professor Yujin Nagasawa. A global perspective of the person expands boundaries, enriches concepts, sometimes by commonality, sometimes by contradictions. When I think about the nature of a person from a global perspective, I think first of Buddhism, which, as I've heard, denies the self but recognizes the person. Why does Buddhism deny the self? I ask a leading Buddhist expert, a philosopher of mind and a philosopher of religion, J. Garfield.
One reason that we tend to think of ourselves as selves is because we have this very strange experience of what I'm going to call Augustinian free agency. That is the idea that we, in our actions, are exempt from the laws of causality. If you're in the criminal court, then being caused to behave in a particular way, either by coercion or mental illness or delusion, is exculpatory, and you only are judged to be criminally responsible if you were free to do the act, which means nothing caused you. So a lot of people think that they only have the ability to act if they've got this free self, because they don't want their behavior to be caused. But what we see is that everything that we do is caused, and we want it to be that way. You don't want your behavior not to be caused by your intentions. You don't want your intentions not to be caused by your beliefs and your experiences and your values. So, if we believe that idea of free will, that Augustinian notion, then we see that that idea of a self is a crazy idea. Another dimension of the self that we might look at is the self as the subject. So, like the way that our eye sees things but doesn't see itself. And when we think of ourselves that way, we're effectively placing ourselves outside of the spatio-temporal world. But do you really believe that you're some non-spatio-temporal thing that somehow mysteriously interacts with the spatio-temporal world? That's nuts. So when Buddhists argue that there's no self, they're saying there's nothing like that. But there is something like this. There's a person. There's an ongoing sequence of physical, psychological, emotional, perceptual, sensory processes that are all causally interlinked among themselves in a very tight way and causally coupled to the rest of the universe. I always think of this as an open causal continuum. But when we talk about a person, we're talking about a psychophysical continuum that's, contained in a body and kind of goes along for a while, and then it ends. Buddhists think of this self as a kind of completely fantasy posit that we instinctively superimpose on our identity as persons, not as something real, but also as a source of enormous delusion. Because the moment that I understand myself as a self, then I've got the duality of self and other. And then I begin to see everything else, including you, as my object. And when you start objectifying other people, but subjectifying yourself, you've built the basis for a really distorted view about your relationship to the world.
So given that there is no self, but there is continued personhood through time, does that obviate in Buddhism any need for a spirit or a soul in any traditional Judeo-Christian or Indian sense?
Yeah, that's the big difference between Buddhism and all of these other traditions. It describes itself as the view of selflessness, the view without a self. It's counterintuitive because we have evolved cognitively for a cognitive illusion to take ourselves to be selves instead of persons. And so I think that Buddhism is working against our innate psychological tendencies. This is that important difference between believing something and experiencing it.
Once you have no self and you really believe that, you have no need for a soul or a spirit.
That's right. That's right. When we're at our best, we're not thematizing the self. And so Buddhism is a vision of virtuoso living without that explicit thematization. And that's hard.
While Buddhism distinguishes self and person, it's not intuitively obvious, but it does reveal a novel sense of seeing human beings. Buddhism is, well, deflationary, given its non-existence of the self and its impermanence of the person. As for myself, I wouldn't like either. I consider my inner awareness to be a self, and I prefer my person to be permanent. Moving eastward, what is the person in Chinese philosophy? I meet a Chinese-American philosopher who specializes in comparative studies of Chinese and Western philosophy, Xiao.
When I read the Chinese philosophers, when they talk about persons or human beings, they tend to look at the proper names in what we may call a racial or religious context. Let me give you an example from my life at Kenyon College. A Russian literature professor, loved by everyone, passed away very young. So after the funeral ceremony, she was buried in the graveyard within the campus. I was talking to the administrative assistant. So this is, I assume, an ordinary person from the local community. She said something so profound, so moving. I had tears in my eyes. She said to me, Natasha's grave is in such a good location. She can see Ascension. That's where her office is. My office is also in Ascension. Well, no philosophy of language, no theory of proper names, as far as I know, can make sense of that sentence. Right? It can't be, had she be alive, standing on her own grave, she could have seen Ascension, the proper names of the dead. We don't know how to talk about that. I think if you want to figure out someone's theory of persons, you better look at their theories of proper names.
So now apply it to the Chinese tradition.
It turns out that the Chinese, very early on, they have this ritual called Shi. It consists in a grandson of the deceased to be the representative of the deceased. So you will be doing all kinds of rituals to the boy, who is now not the boy, not the grandson. He is the deceased, okay? So you offer wine, you offer food to him. And then eventually you have the tablet with the proper name of the deceased on it. So I think from there, you already have this theory in ancient China that a proper name is not just a sign that doesn't have meaning, but only have a reference. Think about the national flag. The national flag is a representative of the country. It participates in the life of the country. Being a representative of something is very different from being representation of that thing, right?
Does that reify the
because
individual?
because we think the person is sacred.
Yeah.
That's why the proper names are also sacred. The image of the dead are also sacred.
On the person and the self, I'm intrigued how not-so-different traditions have such radically different perspectives, here Buddhist and Chinese, especially as these two traditions developed at similar times and in similar places. What happens when traditions developed in a separate culture? I think of Africa with its rich diversity of ethnicities. What is the person in African religion? I explore with a philosopher of Islamic and indigenous religions of West and North Africa, Oludamini Ogunnaike.
I'll start with the case that I know best, which is the Yoruba tradition, in which, if you want to talk about individual personhood, perhaps the most important thing is this notion or concept of Ori. Ori literally means head, but it also means a kind of a guardian angel, your particular destiny, your sense of individuality. Before we come into this world, we each choose our head, we choose our destiny. And then on our way down to earth, we pass under the tree of forgetfulness, and we forget what our destiny is. And if we start diverging from our destiny, things don't go well for us. And so when you run into problems, you're supposed to go consult diviners. The titular deity, the founding Orisha figure of the tradition of divination, is the only one who's supposed to have witnessed everyone's choice of destiny. So through the process of divination, they can tell you what your destiny is, help you get your life back on track. So this notion of Ori is really, really central to the idea of who a person is, what your life was about. And this choice of destiny in heaven outside of time then kind of plays itself out in time as well.
So how is that mediated? Is it by a substance, like a spiritual substance?
It's identified literally with your head, with your physical head. So, but every body part within the traditional Yoruba conception has an outer and an inner.
Okay.
So the outer head is your physical head with this. Your inner head is the spiritual reality. Your outer legs are these muscly things down here. Your inner legs are kind of your endurance, your capacity for effort, and these kinds of things. Same thing with your arms, with your eyes, your face, your ears. What's going on here is not so much physical versus non-physical, it's outer and inner.
Okay.
That is immediately available to the senses, not immediately available to the senses.
So that's a different scale.
Yeah, so this different scale and schema produces kind of a whole different sense of personhood.
What is the you?
So one is the Emi, which is the breath of life, that comes straight from Olodumare into the body of the person. And so that Emi is the animating consciousness, you could say, the animating breath, the animating force that everyone has. And it's a bit from Olodumare, directly from the Supreme Creator.
So what happens after death to that animating force?
So there's a separation of then the outer body. The animating force returns to Olodumare and then can take on another body, the body sculpted by a different Orisha or Batala, who's kind of like the sculptor.
So is that an eternal... I love that the African Yoruba tradition views the person on a different scale with a different schema, outside, inside versus physical, non-physical. This exemplifies how global philosophy of religion expands human thinking about big questions. From Africa to the Middle East, to the non-Western Abrahamic religion, Islam. What is the person in Islam? What is the relationship between body and soul? Is the Islamic soul an immortal soul? I ask an expert in Islamic philosophy, medieval philosophy, and philosophy of religion, Imran Aijaz.
In the mainstream Islamic tradition, there is a distinction between the physical body and the soul. And the way to justify this, I think, at least theologically, is just to point out how in the Quran, there does seem to be a very clear distinction between the soul and the physical body.
Is the soul something substantive?
In the Islamic philosophical tradition, there's quite a heavy Greek influence. When you read, for example, Plato's Phaedo, the soul is defined as something incorporeal, distinct from the body, and death is separation of that incorporeal soul from the body. Certainly, I think in the Islamic philosophical tradition, you have people who develop and defend that view, though I would say in a way that's not necessitated by the Islamic texts, which are open to the other interpretation of the soul.
So there's no radically required immortality of the soul?
No, I don't think so, because What is critical in Islam when it comes to eschatology is the resurrection and the judgment of everybody. Now, here we can ask an important question. Do we need an incorporeal soul for this eschatological drama to play out? Do we need a soul that will then be reunited with a physical body? God will judge us, and then our destinies are secured. And I think just on reflection, we could argue that that's not required. You could have a reconstitution view where God, through his omnipotence, can recreate us in our physical bodies, and then the drama can continue. Though, of course, here you will run into problems of personal identity, right? So I think some, to avoid those problems, will say your identity is secured throughout by this incorporeal soul.
And that's a unique thing.
In the Quran, we read that God had fashioned Adam out of clay, and God had breathed his spirit into Adam, and it is from Adam and Eve that we are all descended. Now, what does that mean? How does the soul come into play? In one of the prophetic traditions, we read that the soul is actually not breathed into the developing fetus until day 40.
Oh, okay.
So, this is very interesting because on that view, life does not begin at conception. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean God directly creates a soul in each and every one of us? If you take this hadith reference, it's close to literally, it seems the answer is yes.
The tension between predestination and free will, does God get involved in that?
There is a scholar, A.J. Wensink, who has this work called The Muslim Creed, where he claims that the early debates about faith and reason were all animated by this controversy about predestination and free will. And so in brief, you had people who occupied both sides of the debate. You had those people who believed in a kind of theological fatalism, a kind of predestination, which they thought is a logical consequence of God's sovereignty. That if God has power over all things, it leaves little to no room for free will. But on the other hand, there were those who thought that if God is the author of everything, if there's no free will, God then is the author of both good and evil. And then how are we to make sense of the commandments that we find in Scripture where God says that we should do this, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, and then there's reward and punishment. So this was a huge debate in the early Islamic tradition. And I would say, even today, there's really no clarity on the subject or a consensus.
That the Quran says little about the soul resonates with similar dearth of discussion in the Hebrew Bible. And when later Islamic and Jewish philosophies stressed the soul, both had been influenced heavily by Greek philosophy. A third Abrahamic religion is, of course, Christianity. And because Christian philosophy has been, at least in the West, the dominant philosophy of religion, and because global philosophy of religion brings world religions to engage with Christian philosophy, I now explore the Christian person and soul. I speak with a Christian philosopher of religion, originally from Singapore, educated in the UK, now teaching in Hong Kong, Andrew Ter-Own Loke.
The mainstream traditional view is that human persons are created in the image of God. And they have a soul and also a body, but these are not separate entities in this life, but they are very closely interconnected. So it's a kind of holistic dualism, and where the body is very much valuable as well. So the biblical view of the body is important, and that's why we find that the most important claim in Christianity is the resurrection of the body, right? The resurrection of Jesus, and that shows that God actually valued the body. Regarding the origin of the souls, there are two different views. One is creationism, and the other is traducianism. So creationism says that every souls of every human persons are directly created by God. So for example, conception, right? When the sperm and the egg meet together, God will create one soul there. But there's another view about the origin of souls, and that is called traducianism, which is that God created the first souls, Adam, for example, and then Eve. And then from there, as they procreate, God has set up a spiritual mechanism in such a way that the gametes, for example, has a kind of soulish potential, such that when the sperm and the egg meet, right? They will generate a person with a soul.
That's sort of an automatic process. God doesn't have to make an effort every time to assign a soul to someone else.
It's a kind of a spiritual natural law, in that sense.
In the first approach to the soul, when God creates each one specially, are all the souls the same and then they are molded by the life? Or is there something special about each one, that each one has its own kind of special personhood?
Yes, I think the second view will be closer to the truth. Each of us are distinct individuals, and our distinctiveness is revealed or manifested in the different free choices that we make in this life. So Christianity both affirm that human beings have free choice, libertarian freedom, but on the other hand, Christianity also talks about that there's a corruption of human nature in the doctrine of original sin.
That wouldn't come from the soul that God creates, or the original sin would come from the physical part, right? It wouldn't come from the soul.
Well, so
Maybe
if you...
under the second tradition, it would come from the soul.
So the second tradition will have will explain the corruption better. So it has greater explanatory power, and that's why I favor the second view. But I actually argue that these two views can be combined in the sense that our soul, or you may call it our soulish material, you might call it soul stuff or whatever, it came down from our parents. But as each person is brought into existence, God specially you may call it functionally created in that sense, like to make that substance into a particular...
I understand what you're doing. Given global philosophy of religion's objective of expanding the discourse beyond Christian philosophy of religion, I'd rather the Christian view of the person and the soul not be the final view. For the final view, I circle back to where I began, to ancient India, with the most ancient Hindu scriptures, the Vedas. I meet a philosopher of Hinduism and Western idealism, a monk in the Advaita Vedanta school, Swami Medhananda.
Hindu traditions conceive the soul, which is the sort of fundamental unit of the human person, as distinct from both the body and distinct from the mind. So Hindu traditions take the mind to be insentient. It's so weird an idea to a Western sensibility that it's hard to understand. But yeah, even the thoughts that come up in our mind, all of that's done in an unconscious, in an insentient way. And the only thing that's conscious is the soul behind it, which is immaterial, and which is illuminating the mind. And so the mind is just a subtle form of physical matter.
How do you differentiate brain and mind?
The brain is physical, and it's a gross form of matter.
Right.
And the mind is a subtle form of matter. And the beauty of in the Hindu view is that you don't have the mind-body kind of dualism problem that you get in Western views like in Descartes, precisely because they're both forms of matter.
So the mind is a subtle form of matter.
Absolutely. And the soul is actually distinct from both mind and body.
Right. And does the soul sort of empower both, or?
Yeah, there are different verbs you can use: enlivens, activates, illuminates. With its consciousness, but the only conscious entity is actually the soul.
So the fact that if I only had a mind in Hinduism, I would not be conscious?
No, absolutely not.
I would not have inner awareness.
No.
What would I have then?
A mind is just this subtle form of matter, like when you have just a chair.
But there are there thoughts and ideas, sensations as part of the mind?
Well, but without the association with the soul, you're not going to get that stuff. So that's why once the physical body departs, so at the time of death, then typically the way that Hindu thinkers explain this is that subtle form of matter in the form of mind will dissolve. The soul departs from the physical body and from the mind, and depending on its karma in this birth, you know, the future trajectory is also determined.
What is a person? What is a self? In Buddhism, the self does not exist, but the person is an ongoing sequence of causally linked processes. In Chinese tradition, proper names are sacred. They have references, not meanings. In the Yoruba traditions of Africa, the person is from a prior world that affects destiny. Distinctions are outer and inner. In Islam, the resurrection and the judgment are essential, but immortal souls are not. There are disputes on this. In Christianity, the holism of body and soul is essential, as is the resurrection of the body. In Hinduism, the body-brain is a gross form of matter. The mind is a subtle form, and the soul illuminates the mind with consciousness. Although Buddhism and Hinduism both originated in India, the no-self in Buddhism dead set opposes the significant self in Hinduism. Abrahamic traditions have two categories: body-brain and mind-soul. Hinduism has three categories: body-brain, mind, and soul. For apprehending the person, I prefer not a narrowing of perspectives, but a widening. I appreciate global philosophy of religion for bringing me closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.